Hi, I'm Andy Igrejas. I'm the director of Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families. It's a coalition of 200 groups working to overhaul federal policy on toxic chemicals. And the basic problem is that there's 80,000 chemicals right now in the U.S. economy. Only 5 of them have been restricted. Even chemicals like asbestos and lead haven't been regulated effectively by the federal government. And we're trying to change that so that chemicals have to be proven safe before they get on the market, and the ones that are on the market have to be proven safe as well in order to stay on the market. And our website is saferchemicals.org. There's legislation in Congress that would change this stuff. We encourage everyone to get involved through our website and help us pass this law through Congress.
And what got you involved in this kind of work?
I grew up in Newark, New Jersey. My grandfather was a leather tanner and started a union of leather tanners before I was born, actually, and I lived in an industrial neighborhood and got involved in environmental stuff then as a high school kid. But I've worked in New Jersey and in California and now work in Washington on reform issues.
Hello and welcome to On Point. I'm Monica Trauzi. Joining me today is Andy Igrejas, National Campaign Director at Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families. Andy, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Andy, New Jersey Senator Frank Lautenberg recently announced he would not be seeking re-election and that he would make toxics reform a priority for the remaining 2 years of his time in the Senate. What are your expectations for how the Senate's going to take this up? And does it really have the potential to move out of committee, considering the current political climate?
I think it does. I think his announcement, and he put the Safe Chemicals Act and toxic reform front and center in his announcement as part of a 2-year mission to get this through. So I think that has added some urgency, given a boost to it. I think we'll see the Senate act this year, that the committee will act by sometime this summer with plenty of time to have this move through the floor. I think it will get out of committee. It's gotten out of committee before. And I think that there is Republican support for this agenda, for a version of this agenda. Whether it can materialize in the committee or materialize after, we'll see. But we're pretty positive that this is the year that this will get to the Senate floor.
So the senator indicated that he would reintroduce the bill soon.
He's going to reintroduce soon.
What kind of timeline does that mean? I mean,
I think within weeks. Within weeks, yeah.
There's talk that Senator Vitter will introduce a chemical reform bill. Is this healthy competition, and could it ultimately lead to a stronger bill, or do you think this might muddy the waters a bit when it comes to actually getting something to finally pass? It
remains to be seen. I think that there's a version of it that could be healthy competition, but the version of it that they've telegraphed, at least with public comments, is a bill that actually could be a step backwards. And a number of health organizations wrote to Senator Vitter recently expressing that concern, because they've telegraphed a set of points that are really at odds with the mainstream medical and health community's positions on how chemicals should be judged. And the process that they followed has only had input from a very small number of chemical companies. And I don't think that, unless they change course or unless the bill were pleasantly surprised, I think we could see a bill that will flout the recommendations, for example, of the American Academy of Pediatrics and all these other organizations, the Nurses Association, Public Health Association, in favor of something that is just what Dow and ExxonMobil would want, on their own. And I think that won't have enough credibility to necessarily get something to be a healthy addition to the debate. But we'll see.
Does the Lautenberg bill take into account the concerns of the chemical industry? Does it do that enough?
I think it has. He had input from a lot of different folks over the course of the debate. There was a process he held with Senator Inhofe last year that had input from lots of different trade associations, as well as the Health and Environment Committee. He rewrote the legislation. The version that passed committee included a number of changes to major areas: confidential business information, new chemicals, how new chemicals are judged, other things, how the chemicals are prioritized. That flowed directly from the input that was received from that process. So I think they have taken into account a number of chemical industry concerns, but I think they're willing to go further depending on how people come forward.
If Lautenberg is not able to move this through in the 2 years he has left in the Senate, then who do you look to in Congress to sort of champion this type of legislation?
First things first, I think we're going to get action this year in the Senate. But if you look through the list of co-sponsors, there's a number of people who have been pretty outspoken on this issue. There's some on the committee, there's some in leadership, Senator Durbin, Senator Gillibrand, Senator Whitehouse, Senator Merkley. There's a number of people. I think it's a target-rich environment for the people who would champion this going forward.
The chemical industry is most concerned about sort of cumbersome and onerous regulatory system that could be created by this legislation. When you push for these types of reforms, do you take into account the jobs and economic impacts that could happen as a result of maybe the industry thinking these regulations are too onerous?
Very much so. I think we had our campaign and the leadership of national health and environmental nonprofits had an extensive dialogue with folks in the chemical industry from major companies. We've had dialogue with some other companies that increased our understanding, and that's what some of the changes that occurred in the committee were about addressing that. In particular, the idea of not having a lot of a requirement to develop a lot of information, health and safety information, if the EPA wasn't going to act on it very quickly, and have an orderly process for which chemicals get reviewed, that kind of thing. The lessons that they draw from what Europe has done in reforming chemical policy. So we're very prepared and think that ultimately to get this through, there's got to be the industry has to come forward and be straight about what they want to see in reform and how to make it more workable. But they also have to honor the fact that there are some standards out there that the scientists and the health professionals have established, that in some cases have been in law for a long time, that would be a minimum level of credibility, that if we're going to say that chemicals are being reviewed for safety, that they'd have to meet. So they're going to have to up their game if they want the stamp of approval, basically, from the EPA, that after they've looked at a chemical and want to say that it's safe.
All right, we will end it there. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you. The public basically wants safer materials. They don't like that someone isn't minding the store.
Andy Igrejas is director of Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families.
If we can't get Washington to address this problem in some way that really benefits public health and also benefits the business environment, we'll see more private efforts in the marketplace. I think we'll see more companies start to adopt their own chemical policies, trying to weed out the known bad chemicals and trying to find out whatever they can find out about the other chemicals that are out there.
I think the hearing today went well from the perspective of public health and the environment, in that it aired the key critique of the bill from public health, environmental experts, and state governments, and it was, I think, clear that those issues have to be addressed for this bill to move forward. So that was a victory as far as these things go.
And which bill do you favor?
Well, I think the Boxer-Markey bill is clearly provides strong public health protections without any of the downside risks that you have in the Vitter-Udall bill, because both provides clearer health protections and more aggressive action, but doesn't take away any authority from states. So it's clearly preferable, the Boxer-Markey bill. The Vitter-Udall bill is improved over last year. We've acknowledged those improvements, but it needs significantly more work to get to the point where it would provide clear progress over the status quo.
Which bill do you think would give a better shot at banning asbestos?
Well, the Boxer-Markey legislation actually names asbestos and instructs EPA to go forth and ban it. So that's an easy distinction to make. The other bill, EPA would have to study asbestos again before it could attempt to ban it, and there'd still be the hurdles to jump through before it could ban it.
And it could be all kinds of political intertwinings on both the corporate side or political side, right?
Shockingly, there is still an asbestos lobby, a pro-asbestos lobby out there, and they have some influence. Sure, we know there is a tobacco lobby, but people smoked cigarettes. Right. So there are people who liked tobacco as a hobby. No one really liked asbestos, and it kills some of the people. So that is a little shocking.
So, what is your last question? What is your hope for the outcome here?
My hope would be that the legislation, after this process, they address the flaws and they take some of the elements in the Vitter-Udall bill. They take some of the elements from the Boxer-Markey bill that would strengthen it, and they come up with new legislation that would really fix TSCA, would provide clear health and environmental benefits, that would preserve a strong role for the states, and we wind up reforming this law in a way that is broadly supportable by the public health community, by Republicans, Democrats, and which also gives the chemical industry, a fair system, but not one that they dominate.
Joining me now to talk more about tomorrow's Stroller Brigade and the importance of introducing meaningful chemical reform laws are Jennifer Beals, actress and activist, and Andy Igrejas, Executive Director of Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families. Jennifer, Andy, welcome.
Thank you.
Great to have you with us. Andy, what are the issues? What are the chemicals? Where are these things? Are we talking about, detergents? Are we talking about paint on toys? Are we talking all of the above?
It's
carpets?
all of the above, and the chemicals you're exposed to in in the workplace or in your community. Chemicals that can get into the drinking water or get into the air. But the most unregulated area is actually the chemicals in the consumer products that you bring into your home. And it's not just the things you think of when you think of chemicals like detergents, but couch cushions that have been soaked with toxic flame retardants that now show up in every nursing mother's breast milk. Chemicals that didn't exist 40 years ago. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about. And there's no federal system to really look at all of that and make sure that it is adding up to something that isn't causing these diseases. That is healthy, that is okay. So you both have known toxic chemicals that make their way into these products, and you have the vast majority of chemicals where their health effects have never really been studied, and yet they get to be used in products that we bring into our homes. And so reform has to tackle both problems. The law that was supposed to take care of this, that passed in the 70s, really is the one of the original environmental laws that did things like the Clean Air Act, all those. But this is the one that never got off the ground, that never had a heyday. The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, they all have made a big difference. There's debates about how aggressively we can implement them, et cetera, but they've at least done something. But the Toxic Substances Control Act, it never really worked, and the idea is to have a new reform, and there's one in Congress now, that would finally fix these problems, but the one that's before Congress right now would repeat the same mistakes. And so you'd have reform in name only, and you'd still basically have chemicals not being regulated to protect public health, and that's what we're here to focus on.
Why is that?
I think the chemical industry has had too much influence over the process. The legislation is skewed in their favor. There's a lot of their favorite phrases about science and other things are in the legislation. There are new opportunities provided for them to sue EPA. There are new restrictions put on states. The states are the place that where we have had success in the last 30 years in actually tackling toxic chemicals. California, Washington, Maine, some other states. And so we're trying to, the message of the Stroller Brigade is we do want reform, we do want it to be bipartisan in order to get something done, but it has to be meaningful. It has to work backwards from what the doctors and the scientists have said is meaningful reform. There's a bill before Congress, the Chemical Safety Improvement Act. It's in the Senate Environment Committee, and the fixes that would be needed to make it meaningful and truly protective of public health are very clear, and a group of folks have articulated them, not just us, but the pediatricians and obstetricians and gynecologists, medical and scientific organizations. And we're confident that if they really want to do this, how to do it is pretty clear. And Senator Boxer, who chairs that committee, is negotiating to try and make that happen right now. So we're reasonably hopeful. The legislation, Senator Lautenberg was a champion of the reform for a long time that all the public health and environmental communities supported. And just only a couple weeks before his death, he created this deal with Senator Vitter. Senator Manchin actually brought them together. Senator Vitter was going to have his own bill, and instead Senator Manchin brought them together to try and come up with a compromise. And I think they had a week to do it, basically, and they just got stuff wrong. I mean, there doesn't need to be a sinister motivation behind it.
But you're DC, why not?
Why not?
Be a skeptic.
But there's some basic standards out there. So the good news is there's a bipartisan vehicle. It's got 26 co-sponsors, and it's before the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. That kind of breadth of support is the kind of thing that means it can maybe get done. The House is talking about doing their own bill, so that's good. The bad part is the details, as Jennifer said. This issue has been succeeding in sort of the real world. Walmart and Target just announced major policies to restrict the chemicals in their supply chain, reacting to the concern of parents like Jennifer and others around the country. So the public support and action at the state level has been there in the marketplace, but getting it on the agenda in a real way in Washington. So not only is it on the agenda, but on the agenda to do the right thing and to get the details right is the hard part. And that is where we have turned to folks like Jennifer. We're very glad to have her here, as well as hearing from folks in the district. So I want to turn a lot of the consumer power that's made a difference into a more political power to have the same moms that are shopping and getting Walmart to change what it's doing are talking to their members of Congress and getting them to get the federal government to get on the ball.
We were saying off camera, like, there are acceptable levels. I mean, there was a documentary called Unacceptable Levels that the law actually says there's a level beneath which it's okay if you're exposed to, right? I mean,
right. And then the question is,
so is the goal then shrinking those levels or just annihilating them completely?
For most chemicals, levels like that have not been set, especially for when they're used in consumer products.
Yeah.
So part of the problem is that even for the vast majority of chemicals that you come into contact with from a mixture of the environment, but also the products in your home or in your workplace, you actually don't, the federal government hasn't done the work to say, oh, at what point does this cause harm? And gee, are people getting exposed to that level or above it? That we actually don't have that system in place right now. Well, I think Senator Boxer, the chair of the Environment and Public Works Committee, has made it clear that she doesn't want this legislation to move unless these same issues are addressed. And so we definitely support her call to make sure these are addressed. But another, I give Senator Vitter credit, who's the remaining original co-sponsor on the bill, that he has said publicly that he has heard a bunch of these concerns and is willing to negotiate with her over it. So we are cautiously optimistic, to use a Beltway type term, that they could actually negotiate over this and improve the bill to the point where it's a credible, meaningful reform.
And it's exciting that it's a bipartisan bill. I mean, everybody wants to protect their children.
Right.
Everybody wants to protect pregnant
You'd hope.
mothers,
Right.
That's, I think, sort of a no-brainer.
All right, Jennifer Beals, Andy Igrejas. It's the stroller brigade that takes place on Capitol Hill on Tuesday. Literally strollers and literally a brigade. That would be great.
Every mom is trained in jiu-jitsu for the event. Yeah.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We've seen the power of the marketplace to make changes that have helped people, that have led to safer products and safer materials. And the most profound changes have come from retailers. When they make a change, it ripples throughout the whole supply chain, throughout the whole economy. So with Mind the Store, we're trying to get in front of the problem and say, you know what, here's a bigger list of chemicals that we know cause problems. Can you, the retailer, ask all the people whose products you sell to develop a plan to move away from those chemicals? Our website, mindthestore.org, spells out the 100 chemicals that we're asking retailers to take action on, and then it provides opportunities for you to weigh in with the retailers directly.
And with all the talk about Hancock 2, some other ballot initiatives aren't getting as much attention. Today, supporters of Proposition A stopped in Columbia and Jefferson City to make a pitch for their campaign finance reform initiative.
It doesn't result in better government or more informed voters. It results in more negative attack ads, more negative junk mail. Voters are sick of that. I think voters would like to see campaigns change, would like to see campaigns be more grassroots.
The state should be doing a better job with its motor voter program. That's the conclusion of the New Jersey Public Interest Research Group, which says, despite the fact that voter registration is up this year over last, the program needs better monitoring and better trained personnel, as Kent St. John reports.
The Motor Voter Law of New Jersey, passed in 1991, requires the Division of Motor Vehicles make voter registration forms available to every applicant for a driver's license renewal, correction, or state-issued ID. According to the Public Interest Research Group, or PIRG, the law also requires Department of Motor Vehicle employees to ask every applicant if they wish to be registered. Today, PIRG announced the results of a survey of 121 patrons from 10 DMV centers across the state.
And we found that of those 121 people, only 8 noticed a display that was alerting them to the fact that they could register to vote there. Only 2 were asked about their registration status. Then 38 out of those 121 people were actually unregistered. And only one of those 38 was registered as a result of the law.
PIRG says even though the survey was quick, they believe implementation of the program is lax. However, figures for motor voter registration for 1992 show that of over 121,000 new registrations in the state, over 69,000, or 58%, were done at motor vehicle agencies. But PIRG maintains the program should be expanded to other agencies.
The Division of Taxation, Unemployment, the county welfare offices, and I believe even New Jersey Transit was mentioned in the original law.
Berg is now asking Governor-elect Whitman for help to not only assist the current program, but to expand it as well. Kent St. John, NJN News, Trenton.
State and private sector toy safety advocates say the federal government has been unwilling to take a firmer grasp on the toy industry and demand changes.
The Commission's sluggishness in responding to a lot of toy hazards and its failure to address some other hazards has led to unnecessary pain and suffering for children across the country in the last couple of years.
An example of the federal agency's failure to identify a hazard?
It was represented as a hazard in 1992, and it's still out in the market today.
New Jersey correspondent Terry Ruggles tonight shows us some of the items you don't want to put under the Christmas tree.
It's nice and soft, it has big bright colors, but actually this necklace comes undone very easily. This is one of the worst spares I've ever found. And it just comes right off like that. And that's a strangulation hazard.
But toys that look to be a safe size can still be potential troublemakers, like this remote-controlled car.
There have been more than a couple of instances where this car just went off on its own, got tangled in one case in the girl's hair, and the parents couldn't shut it off because it has no off switch here.
Congressman is pushing for tough federal legislation that would stiffen fines and penalties against companies which continually pollute the nation's waterways. As Kent St. John reports, the legislation is based on New Jersey's Clean Water Enforcement Act.
Clean water enforcement clearly works. That minimum mandatory fines, that having the fines equal at least the amount that the corporation benefited by polluting as opposed to cleaning up their act, that is actually what is causing companies to not violate the law and to clean up their act, and that we need to push that on a national level. New Jersey law is particularly successful, and New Jersey companies that are complying with the law in a much greater degrees, and that's good. These 4 companies, according to the EPA, though, are those few that still aren't. So in that sense, they're the few bad examples that are left over.
Andy, tell us a little bit more about this Better Way. How is Congress involved in this?
Sure. There's legislation called the Safe Chemicals Act. It's sponsored by Senator Lautenberg, and it would really establish for the first time the kind of system that a lot of people think we have now and that we don't have, where chemicals have to be shown to be safe, new chemicals have to be shown to be safe before they wind up in the products in our homes. And a lot of the chemicals that are used right now would be reviewed, and those that do have health concerns would be restricted to prevent exposures that could cause illness. Because there's really a lot of chemicals out there that we know are linked to illnesses like cancer, infertility, birth defects, learning disabilities, and they still get to be used without the government really having a handle on how they're used. And that's the thing that needs to change, and that's what the Safe Chemicals Act would do.
And Jessica, as a mom, I'm sure that's why you got involved in this. What can moms out there do real quick before you guys have to go?
Well, there are 2 things. One thing is moms out there can go to saferchemicals.org and sign up, and that will immediately put pressure on your local government official to sign up and push forth this act, and also join the Safer Chemicals Healthy Families Facebook page to join some stroller brigades.
All right, thanks.
The Safer Chemicals Healthy Families is a coalition of 450 health and environmental organizations, industrial unions in steel and automobiles, as well as businesses, some large, some small, from around the country. There's a broad political spectrum, actually, of membership in the organization and the coalition.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Andy Igrejas, Director of Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families. Welcome back. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Tonko. I'm pleased to be here, as like the other witnesses are. Safer Chemicals Healthy Families is a coalition of 450 organizations and businesses. It ranges from the Learning Disabilities Association, Steelworkers Union, large health providers like Dignity Health, and the major national environmental organizations. We all came together to reform TSCA in 2009, and we definitely want to have it happen sooner than later, and we're glad to work with the committee toward that end. I want to highlight what we see as positive in the draft, what's missing, and some ideas for how to move forward. I want to say also up front that we think the more targeted approach that you've taken does hold a lot of promise. There's a lot that it potentially solves and points a way forward, and also to identify some of the elements that are in there that we support. The absence of a complicated prioritization scheme we think is wise. It avoids the downside of the low priority loophole that a lot of us are concerned about. You've also heard from EPA that they already have a prioritization criteria. They've gone through, they had public input, et cetera. the approach to preemption, by preserving more of TSCA's existing preemption, you avoid the controversy of the void or the suspension whereby states are blocked just because EPA is looking at something, and we appreciate that. The draft also doesn't roll back EPA's authority on products or imports, so we think you've threaded the needle on the issue of products and don't take away authority on some of these other areas. It does make it easier to require toxicity testing. It does remove the least burdensome requirement, which was an issue in the asbestos decision, and vulnerable populations are addressed, though there's some clarifications potentially needed around the rulemakings. I want to focus on the issue of cost and see if I can add some value. It was talked about a lot. We basically agreed with where EPA came down on this, that we don't see that issue as solved in this draft. And to try and put it simply, I think in our vision, you want the risk evaluations to clearly identify the risk, including the vulnerable populations, and you want the rulemaking to have to protect against that risk very clearly. And then the cost considerations, including cost effectiveness, comes into play with how EPA does that, which can mean longer time frames for implementing some particularly costly piece of the risk management. It can include choosing a more cost-effective way of addressing the risk over another way, but you don't want it to be a limitation on whether the risk is addressed at all. And that's the key distinction that we still see as potentially not solved. So it literally comes down to, will you have a risk hanging out there that EPA has identified, and at the end we'll be able to tell the story that the public is now protected from that risk and have that be true, or we potentially have the story that EPA winds up saying, we actually didn't protect against the risk because a court found that we couldn't prove that the cancer cases and the hospital visits, lost work, et cetera, outweighed the cost to the companies to move to the safer alternative. That's the difference that this hinges on. And so I'm not sure if we have a difference of intent or of interpretation of the language, but that's the key thing we'd like to see solved, is that the risk management has to protect against the risk. We also would agree with what's been said about the imbalance between industry assessments and the assessments EPA would undertake under its own power under the draft. Really, the industry assessments are the only thing driving EPA activity under this draft. They have to agree to these requests and they have to undertake them. And on the flip side, they have to go through some hoops before they can undertake an assessment, and that creates an imbalance that we think could lead to them looking more at the chemicals that are already being managed well or that are already safe, that have a lot of data, instead of the ones that are causing problems out in the real world right now. And so we think if you got rid of those extra barriers, put in place, this issue came up of 20 chemicals a year, a requirement perhaps to do that. That's a nice round number. Maybe giving them a deadline to complete work on the chemicals that have been talked about, the 90 work plan chemicals. Then we're on our way to driving some EPA action on the chemicals, in addition to having this industry initiated assessments. We agree with what's been said about fees. I've mentioned some other issues in more detail in the written testimony around the science provisions in the bill. We think that you could take, if you're going with less is more, you can go all the way and not direct EPA to take position on some of these scientific questions. But if you're going to do that, there are places in the bill where what you're calling for is stuff that the National Academy of Sciences has actually said EPA shouldn't do, and there are some things the National Academies have said EPA should do that aren't in there. And so I'd say pull back or go further with what the National Academies would like to do. Persistent bioaccumulative toxins, these are the chemicals that are like PCBs, one of the only success stories of the original TSCA. There's a limited number of them, chemicals that are like that, identifying them early and requiring action. So I'll stop there, but just say that we think all of the issues that we've identified are things that could be solved in the draft. We wouldn't support the draft in its current form, but with the changes that we've talked about, it could be gotten in shape where you'd have a genuine public health achievement here.
Hi, thank you very much. Really honored to get this. Liz is our government affairs director who's been working hard on this issue for a very long time. We were talking before that we thought really we should be having a meeting and honoring ADAO because of the groups in the coalition. There are many groups, and there's other groups that are focused on a particular disease. There's traditional environmental groups, lots of community-based groups, environmental justice groups, and a few unions. The steelworkers were the most active in the campaign among labor organizations. And the thing I think that makes ADAO so special is you have at least three things going for you that not a lot of groups have. I think the first thing is definitely the most authoritative analysis of the issue with all the experts that you've pulled together. And Linda invited me to a meeting you guys had with the EPA in the fall, and it was great to see the career EPA staff, so the people who really do know stuff were still like, just there lapping up all this detail and asking for more and more detail about where asbestos is used and what they could do about it. And that kind of thing, not a lot of groups have that depth of expertise. I think the other thing is the numbers, bringing a significant number of people to the Hill when you have lobby days and events. And you see that with this group of people. There's a large, decent group of people here, and you've been kept them together for quite some time. And then I think the most important thing is the moral authority of speaking on behalf of victims. And not many groups have all of those things together. And I guess the fourth thing would be Linda herself, who is like a, yeah, is sort of like a walking reality check for politicians when they're getting full of crap. And I've seen her knock lots of people back on their heels, and because they didn't know what they were talking about, and they didn't have those things, the numbers, the moral authority, or the authoritative analysis. And it's always been the right people who have been knocked back on their heels. I've never seen her do that to the wrong person, so that's an important weapon too. So thank you very much. Thanks for your work. Please keep it up. And just one thing I'm sad about is that we didn't manage to ban asbestos in this reform last June. As some of you know, it was a struggle just to keep the reform on track as an actual reform, where for a couple of years it was turned upside down, where it was actually a rollback in the guise of reform, a rollback backed by enormous lobbying campaign by the chemical industry and a propaganda effort that sucked in a lot of people who otherwise should have known better, Democrats and some other people. It didn't suck in John Tester. He was someone who held out until the bill got above water and was back to being mostly a reform before he was willing to vote for it. And that kind of resistance from some principled people in Congress is what eventually changes. And those people, though, had to be backed up by people like you and other members of the coalition too. But that's so thank you. So keep it up. We're very pleased, Liz and I, to get this award, and the other on behalf of it's a small organization. There's only 5 of us, but we have the coordinating a big coalition, and there's power in numbers and solidarity, as you know. So thank you very much.